These days, John and Jane Q. America have every reason to think of beaches as violent places. There's been a lot of large-scale war the last few decades, fought with advanced amphibious military strategies and technology. This means foamy coasts from Sicily to Normandy to Inchon and Korea have garnered new and bloody histories. With the nuclear brinksmanship of the Cold War, the beach has even come to be associated with Armageddon. The most conspicuous example of this, of course, was the 1957 Neville Shute novel On the Beach, and the 1959 film adaptation of the same name, in which the inhabitants of the coastal city of Melbourne, Australia, among the few survivors of a global nuclear war, stand oceanside and watch for the approaching cloud of radioactive dust that's sure to take their lives and end the human race on Earth. It's hard to get further from the American mainland than Australia. Wars sweeping over beaches closer to home, namely in the Cuban Bay of Pigs. In this instance, though, America's doing the sweeping. After the socialist Fidel Castro overthrew the U.S.-friendly Cuban military dictator Fulgencio Batista in Cuba in 1959, the U.S. military found itself countenancing the rise of an evident Soviet client state less than 100 miles from the American mainland. In the wake of the revolution, the Eisenhower administration and the CIA sought ways to dispose of the fiery Castro. They concocted many preposterous stratagems, including fooling the Cubans into thinking the second coming of Christ had arrived, and secretly importing off-balance ball bearings into Cuba to sabotage their economy. The plan that came nearest to fruition was a surprise assault on the Castro military seaside outposts, using Cuban expatriates and private mercenaries under the tutelage of CIA advisors. A covert operation and therefore restricted in scale, the invasion could not overthrow the Cuban military in a direct firefight. Rather, its planners hoped it would spark insurrection among the Cubans who were presumably chafing under Castro's dictatorial rule. The invasions failed, and most of the outgunned invasion force wound up killed or captured. Depending on whom you ask, the assault foundered either because the rookie President Kennedy, fearing that the secret operation would be exposed if U.S. planes got involved, ineptly withheld air support for the deploying troops at the last minute, or because the theory that the incursion would spark popular uprising was misguided from the beginning. Those on all sides bewailed the souls lost in the folded invasion, and rightly so. But the common claim that the casualties were fervent Cuban patriots all fiercely committed to liberating the nation from communist tyranny was significantly exaggerated. Political zealots doubtless numbered among the perished and the corralled, but so, in significant numbers, did mercenaries, down-and-out drifters, and wayward youths. Contemporaneous accounts of the invasion, whether testimonial or fictitious, are hard to come by, partly because so few participants were available to talk to Western journalists afterwards, and partly because few Americans wanted to revisit the awful episode. But those that do exist corroborate this. Take the bizarrely titled, How I Signed Up at $250 a Month for the Big Parade Through Havana, blah, 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 and wound up in Guatemala with the CIA. An interview by 60s beat journalist Terry Southern of Boris Grigorovich, who would be Bay of Pigs combatant, conducted for Esquire in 1963. Little informed about the political situation in Cuba, Grigorovich professes that his initial interest in enlisting in January of 61 is that it offers a ticket to balmy Florida and therefore an escape from Manhattan's bitter cold. When it becomes clear to Grigorovich and his friend Ramon that they are being enlisted into a military operation, the recruiters ply them with bottles of rum, promises of $250 a month compensation, and assurances that the Cubans would never be able to stand up to the superior American forces, and that therefore they had nothing to fear. I mean, the picture they were painting had battleships in it, Dad. You know? Rockets against pitchforks. Well, man, I mean, how could we lose? Cuba versus America. Are you kidding? The combination of easy money and assurances of safety was attractive to people from all walks of life, from Cuban expats to Southerns anything is better than home types, to prospects like Grigorovich, who merely hoped to escape the cold and settle some gambling debts. In another venue, Southern even writes about an American architect who enlists to alleviate the crushing boredom of his job. far from the traditional view that the Cuban counter-revolutionaries were righteous soldiers thwarted by executive indecision. The men Gagarovich and Southern's other witnesses describe are largely apathetic civilians who had enlisted for all the wrong reasons, had been misled in what they were getting into, and were subsequently ill-trained by operatives who cared less about creating an effective force than keeping the affair from being found out or infiltrated. The sole cinematic account of the Bay of Pigs invasion appears to be Red Zone Cuba, episode 6-19, a little-known zero-budget grindhouse goodie directed by a would-be beat noir auteur named Coleman Francis. Glacially paced, nihilistic, ineptly shot, and amateurishly acted, Red Zone Cuba is nevertheless strangely honest to the non-fiction accounts of the invasion, at least if Gagarovich is to be believed. In fact, one suspects Francis must have read Southern's article and taken it to heart. The movie follows three hobos, the sociopathic Griffin, Landis, and Cook, as they wander the arid American countryside in a Depression-style search for the basic amenities. Eventually, they learn that a pair of military forces assembling mercenaries to launch an assault on Cuba, and they figure this is a way to get beds for the night. Supplied with assurances of security and easy money similar to those given Gagarovich, the trio readily agree and soon are shipped off to an unnamed third country to train. In Gagorovich's account, and according to the historical record, this training took place mostly in Guatemala and Honduras. Almost immediately, Griffin and his company run into problems and start trying to back out of their enlistment. For one thing, although the recruiter assures them that they'll be paid in cash, when they get to the training camp, a bookkeeper asks for their names and signatures so that they can be given checks. This is an unfortunate development for them, since their intention was to go AWOL right after they'd gotten their first wages. They're also reluctant to provide this information and would ultimately be afraid to cash the checks since they all have criminal records. Gagarovich has no rap sheet that he mentions, and so shares none of the trio's anxieties about the way he's paid. He nevertheless explains in detail how the mercenaries were compensated. The Juan Paula Company, he explains, naming the CIA front financing the operation. That's the way the checks were paid, from the Juan Paula Company. And then there were some of the CIA faces running around trying to make a cloak and dagger scene out of it. How I signed up also describes the training regimen the recruits endure once they arrive in Guatemala. Basic training, marching calisthenics, rifle range, and then they would train you for some specialty like mortar, machine gun, or something. Red Zone Cuba closely parallels this too, in the long sequences in which Griffin and the other trainees run lazy drills in hand-to-hand combat, cliff scaling, and endurance marching. Where the movie deviates furthest from the article, this is an inevitability of scale. Filmed on a tiny budget, Red Zone Cuba can't hope to duplicate Gagorovich's experience of taking a clandestine C-47 flight out of an abandoned Miami military airport. Griffin and company alight in a single-engine Cessna from a dusty private airship. We're training at a camp cut right out of the side of a mountain and featuring a firing range, a parade ground, barracks, multiple mess halls, and, as in John Vaughn's camp at Mytho, a movie theater. In Red Zone Cuba, the camp consists of a few spare wooden buildings and fewer than a half dozen officers, training no more than 20 or so enlisted men. Here, Red Zone Cuba's inaccuracies seem to arise not from shoddy research on Coleman Francis's part. Whatever else might be wrong with the film, Francis seems to want to be accurate, but a disconnect between the resource and subject. Master low-budget movie maker Roger Corman testified about his modest 1955 shoot-'em-up, 5 Guns West, that the contained situation is a key to low-budget filmmaking. Films about, say, the opening of the Oklahoma land rush don't get made on $60,000 budgets. Ambitious choice of subject seems to have been Francis's main sin, but aside from these practical and technical failings, he shows a certain courage in portraying the fallen soldiers of the Bay of Pigs, not as betrayed Cuban patriots, but as the beatniks, petty criminals, and anti-heroes so many of them evidently were. After Griffin, Landis, and Cook make hostile landfall on the shores of Cuba and are promptly captured, Francis stops trying to capture major military conflicts on film and instead, as Corman would doubtless advise, contracts his narrative to a scale more compatible with his means. While in the Cuban gulag, they meet Bailey, a fellow prisoner dying of a gangrenous wound. Bailey tells them about a rumored load of uranium and tungsten near his home in Arizona and promises to take them there if they'll only help him to escape. Instead, when they make their big break, the nefarious Griffin and company leave Bailey to die as they run off to follow his lead. The events leading to the killing spree in cold blood are set in motion when Perry hears a rumor in jail, ultimately false, that Herbert Clutter keeps a safe in his Kansas home packed with easy money. Once in Arizona, they needlessly murder a blind piano-playing woman and her infirm father in their own home, finally find Bailey's, and fool his grieving wife into thinking that they were friends of his. Together, the four agree to go to the mine in the hopes of plumbing its untapped riches, but the law catches up with them first, and Griffin ends up gunned down in the desert, his own hideous acts catching up with him. Red Zone Cuba, in its willingness to retell the story of the Bay of Pigs to a public uninterested in hearing it, strikes a note of pessimism in portraying a period that was marked by a pronounced optimism. As the Eisenhower and Kennedy years saw one of the biggest economic booms in American history, shopping became a touchstone in Hollywood in the early 1960s and was often shown as somehow vital or linked, however satirically, with a forward-looking sense of life-changing purpose. In this spirit does acquisitiveness salve Holly Golightly's lost soul in Breakfast at Tiffany's, and shameless buffoonery wed with naked avarice in Jerry Lewis's Who's Minding the Store, and the cornball epic It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. This period, too, saw the birth of perhaps the most indulgent feast of consumption in movie history, the James Bond franchise, which, after a relatively austere start with Dr. No in 1962, evolved into a cornucopia of designer goods and snappy gadgets, and From Russia with Love, Goldfinger, and Thunderball. Red Zone Cuba's note of pessimism may be out of sync with the times, but the same can't be said for the avarice of its leading men. Greed is everywhere, and over time the home consumer has grown adept at knowing the cost of things, as The Price of Right offers a way to cross the screen for the folks in their living rooms called the Home Showcase. Here, viewers are invited to bid by postcard on a themed array of products such as a camping set, tent, canoe, paddles, fishing rod, 2 rifles, and so on. Again, the folks at home are called on to perform prodigious feats of cost estimation, and yet, astonishingly, when the camping set is put up for bid on the Home Showcase, Bill Cullen and the gang receive 6 bids accurate to the dollar. The American shopper has proven adept indeed. Similar skills are in evidence in Come Alive, America, a 1965 article from Esquire, the same glossy that brought us How I Signed Up at $250 a month for the blah blah blah. Authors Charles and Bonnie Remsburg here offer up a bit of As It Happens coverage of the Pepsi-Cola-sponsored shopping spree that would later coin the enduring slogan, Come Alive, you're in the Pepsi generation. The heroes, if they can be called such, are the Miller family, who've won the chance to take home whatever they can grab from a grocery store in Taylorville, Illinois, redubbed the Pepsi-Cola capital of the world for the occasion. The ensuing feeding frenzy is to be televised, which presents numerous opportunities for promotional tie-ins. Among them is a Price is Right style contest held at a local tavern, where a free 30-minute eating and drinking spree is offered for the customer who comes closest to guessing the dollar value of the Miller's total take. It's like guessing the number of jelly beans in a jar, but here, as with The Price is Right, the experienced shopper, able to watch as the Millers careen through the aisles and keep a running total of the items they retrieve, is at a distinct advantage. So, too, the Millers themselves, who meticulously case the store to calculate the value-to-volume ratios of various items so that the limited capacity of their shopping carts is put to the best use, and otherwise plan their shopping spree so that when the time comes, they'll spend the least time possible making decisions and the most in reflexively, rapidly retrieving the most value-added goods from the supermarket shelves. Logistics. The irony of planning a spree ahead of time is largely lost on them, as it is on the reporters, technicians, and advertisers on hand. Though the enterprise seems modest and unscripted on screen, in fact, a massive apparatus surrounds the Millers, all of it necessary to keep them on message, avoid embarrassing mistakes come broadcast time, and customize the store to make it more televisual. As a favor to a live audience has been stationed in the parking lot for the occasion, the crew goes so far as to have glaziers take out the store's plate glass windows. Still, once the shopping spree begins in earnest, it looks spontaneous enough. As the family streaks through the supermarket, the authors reflect on their expressions as they try to make split-second decisions on the most dollar-rewarding food choices to make. The looks on their faces as the checkout tape records higher and higher totals. To the Remsburgs, the Millers seem to be in a kind of trance, an impression only compounded when an excited Mrs. Miller is asked how she felt when her family was selected to participate, and she evokes divine will. "I just can't believe I'm on top," she sputters, after taking a pill to calm herself. "It must have been God's hand leading the hand that picked my entry. It's that miraculous." This won't be the only time this year God is thanked not so much for humble gifts as for mammoth heapings of wealth and entitlement. The teen odyssey Village of the Giants, episode 523, takes little from the gluttonous-sounding H.G. Wells story, The Food of the Gods and How It Came to Earth, on which it claims to be based. On the other hand, Village's ne'er-do-wells, Fred and his cohort of young vagabonds, do resemble gods. After a mad scientific concoction swells them to enormous size, they terrorize a small town they were simply passing through, commandeering the local auditorium and strong-arming the sheriff. From him they demand an offering, buckets of fried chicken that look like crumbs in their mammoth hands as they devour them, happy and contented as the Miller family. Kenny's many things in Gamera, the Giant Monster, episodes K05 and 302, but mainly he's a stowaway. Several times Gamera, the titular gigantic reptile that threatens civilization in this earnest knockoff of the Godzilla franchise, connects deeply with young Kenny, who already has a thing for turtles. The earlier courtships seem forced, though. After fledgling Gamera nearly sends Kenny plummeting to his doom, but catches him at the last minute, Kenny lapses into a Fay Rayo-style twirl of hostage infatuation. Alas, the love doesn't seem quite real here either, and this time we're meant to think it is. Even 30-odd years later, King Kong's still too recent, this nod to it not yet far enough along to seem new. What's more, there's this devotion Kenny has for his real pet turtle, Tibby. Could he not be errantly attributing tiny Tibby's gentleness to this savage monster that later lays waste to much of mainland Japan? Kenny's love for Gamera is only validated later when he stashes himself in a cargo crate for shipment to the Brobdingnagian ectotherm. At the moment, Gamera is involved in a tense hostage situation of his own with the Japanese and American powers that be. Since he's immune to conventional attack, which leaves one to wonder why he's got that shell, he needs to be appeased, at least until the military and other strategists come up with a better plan. Otherwise, he's going to smash civilization as we know it. Insisting that the mutant turtle is simply misunderstood, Kenny ultimately smuggles himself onto a conga line of tanker cars being fed to Gamera, since he feasts on fire. This arrangement is just as likely to result in Kenny's death as any other outcome, which puts his commitment to the outsized beast beyond question. Kenny's not just a stowaway literally. Already a hopeless misfit, despite having less than a decade under his belt, he obsesses over turtles as a salve for his incurable loneliness. Officials at his school, inexplicably alarmed over his harmless habit of drawing turtles, are threatening to expel him. His father and older sister want him to set his Tibby free and offer him just about anything in trade, but he'll have none of it.
Come, Toshio. You have to learn to make friends with people.
He's told.
As well as animals, Toshio. Your turtle is very nice, but you have to have other friends, too.
Though he's barely begun in life, he already seems to have done a botched job of sticking himself to the world, and has instead stashed himself in storage too close to the sea. His mother died in his formative years. Maybe she was the soul who could have made him feel like a paying passenger. At last he relents to the family pressure and goes to the edge of the ocean to set Tibby free. Gamera first appears when tiny Tibby paddles out of sight, and he seems to take his place, as though nature had transformed one into the other. Seeing is believing, and Kenny's dad and sister become believers when they set eyes on the roaring beast. Emmerich Contraire is not given any such vindication, since no one in the New York TV studio in which he sits has witnessed Gamera in action. That's too bad. He and Kenny are otherwise clearly kindred spirits, and Emmerich could stand to have a giant turtle to point at matter-of-factly right now. He's been brought on the show to argue for Gamera's existence, after all, and Mr. Manning, author of Non-Science or Nonsense and confirmed skeptic, is making short work of him. He's savagely likened Emmerich to an ignorant ape, accused him of having a college diploma that was made in Japan, and smeared him as a flying saucer buff. Recent polls put percentage of belief in UFOs in the low teens, so this proves a winning tactic. To be fair, Emmerich is kind of asking for it. He says some pretty crazy shit. His discourse has a problematic signal-to-noise ratio, but the gist seems to involve several thousand-year-old gigantic porpoises, and though Manning makes it sound like a bad thing, Emmerich does in fact believe in flying saucers. It turns out, as Manning and his fellow skeptics learn later when they join Kenny's family in the ever-growing secret society of those who've borne witness to the monster, that Gamera can pull his legs into their sockets and blow jet exhaust through the holes. By this mechanism, he flies in the manner of an athlete's spinning discus. So he is a flying saucer of a sort, and until the sight of him becomes a global commonplace, he's reported as one. But he's actually an amalgam of myth and technology, terrestrial and extra. First, he is the fundamental turtle of ancient lore that holds up the world, though one suspects even in ancient times only crackpots believed literally in such notions, they and pranksters after a good laugh. Next comes the jet aircraft, which has brought humanity such progress and meanwhile pushed it so close to ruin. The passenger jet, emblematized in 1965 by the McDonnell Douglas DC-9 and other gossamer harbingers of a smaller globe, brings Dr. Hidaka to Tokyo Airport to arbitrate Emmerich and Manning's dispute. So we know our innovations are enabling all manner of evolution in consciousness. But the Japanese doubtless watched the massive aerial bloodletting the UN forces unleashed in Korea and the handiwork of French jets in neighboring Vietnam. And though Japan and the United States are enjoying a largely beneficent relationship in this decade, the violence of the Americans in conjunction with their technological capabilities has surely given pause to the technocrats in the Japanese security culture. Then finally there's the alien aspect, when Gamera's rotary jets propel him radially along the curve of his shell and cushion him into the air. It's in the manner of a flying saucer, yes, but also that of a helicopter. The Japanese, historically the last great industrial war power in the Far East, are seeing the effective deployment of helicopters in combat situations, primarily as an adjunct to the American advisor effort in the conflict in Vietnam. The Americans' involvement in the ongoing Vietnamese War unnerves the Japanese, but also intrigues them. The Americans are using helicopters to float observers, advisors, combatants, and journalists back and forth from combat areas. The concept of a front line, already problematic in the Korean conflict, is only murkier here. Then they're flown back, retrieving in the process all the intelligence and communication that combat units can make fit for aerial transport. Given that the Americans are promoting hostilities in regions adjacent to and racially coterminous with the Japanese island, the one-time occupied territories of Korea and Vietnam, many Japanese see these incursions as a potential threat. This weaponry, the helicopter, which isn't precisely new but is only now starting to be used effectively in offensive combat, seems invasive and uncategorizable to the Japanese. This is why it's collapsed with alien and jet technologies in the collective imagination. Though Emmerich's American, he's certainly in tune with this. In contrast to Manning's work, is science synonymous with sense? Emmerich has dubbed his tome the factual basis of legends. For him, rumor is laid on a substrate of unverifiable truth.
Read Virgil's Laocoon.
He scolds Manning when the character assassination becomes more than he can bear.
Read Paradise Lost.
He goes on to cite a litany of mystic Western writers in a reverie on the depth and reach of the West's imagination, power, and cruelty.
Read, you ignorant ape!
Beatlemania has certainly matured into a testament to the West's imagination, if not so much its power and cruelty. By 1967, it's official that the Beatles have experienced a spiritual awakening thanks to the influence of Ravi Shankar and the serial ingestion of LSD. A world that saw Elvis Presley's reign has been spending most of the decade in awe of the Beatles' in superhuman fame. Their weird effect on youth in both England and the States only redoubles when they attach this psychedelic transcendentalism to their public image. Like Cary Grant and others who've experimented with the drug, the band, John Lennon and George Harrison in particular, report a greater sense of oneness with the universe, an inexplicable insight into the secret nature of existence, and a reduced connection to ego or self. For decades, musical stardom of various magnitudes has been a reliable theme in the films under consideration here. Kitty from I Accuse My Parents was the beneficiary of a modest form of it, but musical fame ruined Eddie in Beatniks. The difference here seems to be, at least as much as any other factor, that Kitty did all of her performances live, whereas Eddie's were broadcast on television and recorded on vinyl. Many feel that broadcast and recording erode the legitimacy of a musical work, among them the aforementioned Walter Benjamin, whose The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction is the ultimate word on the subject. Another way of getting at the same idea is the oft-told story that native tribes, not yet introduced to modern technology, believe photography steals the soul. Bucking this perception, the Beatles essentially make magnetic recording part of their act. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band features all manner of tape effects, echoes, loops, and samples, which reconfigures their songs by giving them locations. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds sounds literally as though it were set in a breezy meadow. Being for the benefit of Mr. Kite uses garbled recordings of calliopes to create a sense the listener is twirling through a funhouse carnival. In part because of Lennon's controversial comment, the Fab Four has eschewed live performances for 11 months as of Sgt. Pepper's release in July. This gives the act even more of a sense of existing outside reality. Beatles albums aren't, as albums typically are, slightly more honed renditions of the band's live performance, captured in the interest of simulating a concert on the hi-fi in the family living room. The Beatles are no longer really an act at all. Their recordings are the thing. They are the event. In The Deadly Bees, episode 905, the music recording apparatus not only subsumes superstar Vicki Robbins, but very nearly consumes her altogether. Bees opens at the nadir of her descent as she collapses on camera during a TV spot. This was bound to happen sooner or later, considering the ridiculously ambitious touring schedule her handlers were holding her to. Had she not fainted dead away, they had her slated for a bus trip and 2 more shows before the night was even out. What's worse, the intense touring that had already sapped Vicky's constitution has left her ill-equipped to cope with the singular hazards of touring in this go-go age. One such is her opener, The Byrds, not to be confused, or perhaps such confusion is exactly the idea, with the much more serene American folk rock band The Byrds. The ornithological lads blast the studio with screaming vocals and painfully distorted guitar, while reaction shots show a spent Vicky looking queasier and queasier. The loud guitar in particular is cause for alarm. While guitarists like Ray and Dave Davies of the Kinks and Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones often use brash and noisy electric guitar in their performances, the last couple of years have seen bands like Cream take it to a new level. This is accomplished through preamp, the saturation of a guitar's signal with excess power before it is even sent to the amplifier to be boosted to speaker-ready levels. The end result is a tone without peaks and valleys, or to be accurate, a tone with one sustained peak that makes the instrument sound as though it's on fire or malfunctioning. The sound thrills many listeners in Cream songs showcasing it, like Sunshine of Your Love and Tales of Brave Ulysses rocket up the charts. But it inflicts just as much pain as pleasure. Rising star Jimi Hendrix, in his trademark semi-coherent style, refers to the saturated guitar as a public saxophone. In what sense is a saxophone not normally public? And though this is a bit of a head-scratcher, one does think both of the saxophone's volume and its tendency to grate and squeak when played incorrectly, or by design. After the Byrds have finished inflicting this newfangled torture on Vicky, and it should be added that though the lead guitarist emulates Clapton and Hendrix's tone, he has nothing remotely like their skill. She takes to the studio stage to sing her much more tranquil number, Stop the Music. Little is said of Vicky's path to fame, and the origin of this number is never revealed. But if it's meant to be her own composition, it's probably among the more difficult in her set to perform. It tells the simple story of a woman who looks on as her romantic partner dances intimately with another, which is to say, it laments the infidelity of a lost love. This is the most archetypally painful experience someone can undergo, especially a young person, and if the song is inspired by such an event in Vicky's past, presumably she must relive this event every time she performs the number. Complicating matters is the sound echoes sense nature of the song's doggerel lyrics, which evoke Vicky's delirium, even as she sings them in her receding days.
Stop the music, he's dancing with another girl. Stop that music, he's got my heart in a whirl. He could have...
That she collapses mere seconds after uttering the word twirl is either serendipity or a sign that she was just as constitutionally predisposed to fainting spells when she composed the song as she is now upon singing it. In any case, if we assume she must relive the emotional trauma to perform the number, she could scarcely be doing so in a less hospitable place. The Byrds' high-tech guitar wails still rattling the studio's walls, Vicky gets in position to perform, and she must stare into cold, grotesque TV camera lenses and somehow conjure in their place the imaginary rescuer her song's heroine hopes will bring the music to an end. Like the Byrds' guitars and amplifiers, the studio cameras are among the best, with a rotating plate of varying lenses to enhance the shot vocabulary available to the cameraman. Creative performance is difficult enough with a live audience, trickier still in front of a single lens. A lens, though, can at least mimic the eye and humanize the face of a camera to some extent. Instead, Vicky must serenade these bizarre state-of-the-art monstrosities that resemble aliens or seem not to have faces at all. To make matters worse, the operators truck in and out and switch lenses constantly. This is to enhance the spot's dynamics for families at home, but it makes Vicky's sensorium even less hospitable. The director conveys this with several shots from her point of view, the movie camera wrangling with the TV cameras in a melee that must have looked preposterous on set. Finally, the focus goes out and a swooning Vicky keels over, at which point the movie cuts to the reel-to-reel tape recorder playing her track. It goes on even as she loses consciousness. She's been lip-syncing. We've known this since her spot began, but in this moment before the producer cuts the feed, the audience learns it too. What a fissure has opened in Vicky's existence. Not only might her physical life be at risk, no one yet knows that this is simply a fainting spell, least of all her, so is her career. She's been unmasked as a fraud. As the shot of the tape's twirling reel fades to black, the more impressionistic viewer might be left thinking that her being has been transferred to the device, much like the Robinsons are in Lost in Space. This protective absorption by the apparatus is the only thing saving her from the even more savage real fate that met Lee Harvey Oswald and Inajiro Asanuma. Assassination by television, vanishing altogether into the machine. Luckily, Vicky pulls through and her manager sends her to convalesce at a farm on tiny Seagull Island. He happens to know the farm's owner. Her producer objects at first, but the fainting spell has made plain that the demands on her have been unreasonable, so he relents. Life on the Hargrove property seems to be just what Vicky needs. The island's remote and picturesque, the daily rhythms slow, the nearby pub well-kept and homey. All the comforts of a quaint English town are here. But as we've learned repeatedly now, not just in B's screenwriter Robert Bloch's novel Psycho, but also in Bloodlust and its fellow imitators, out-of-the-way places tend not to be as peaceful as they seem. For one thing, Ralph Hargrove drinks perhaps to excess, though never to intoxication. His disconsolate wife Mary indulges an analogous craving for nicotine, and a cigarette is rarely far from her lips as she skulks about the farmhouse or sits idle, staring off into the middle distance. Considering her chronic fear of death, the atomic brain's Mrs. March would make an unlikely chain smoker, but it's otherwise easy to think of her here, sorrowfully wandering the same halls she'd once graced as a younger woman. Also disconcerting is the fact that Hargrove is an apiarist. There's no social stigma attached to keeping beehives, but they're marginally dangerous. Multiple stings can be painful and sickening or even fatal to those with allergies. More to the point, bees are the common cause of exaggerated but perfectly understandable phobias for many. Perhaps even more to the point, their constant irritating drone poses a particular threat to the recently traumatized Vicky. The birds' guitars, don't forget, are still ringing in her head. Thus she gives Hargrove's hives a wide berth as she acclimates to Seagull Island and starts about the work of getting well. Otherwise she gives the matter little thought. Privileged with knowledge of the movie's title, of course, the audience also knows to attach far more importance to this development than Vicky does. Sure enough, the bees start attacking everyone around. First they swarm and kill Mary's dog, then terrorize Doris, the temporary housemaid, and ultimately kill Mary. This attracts the suspicions of the local constabulary, and Hargrove is drawn into an inquest regarding the circumstances of Mary's death. The inquisitors fail to pin anything on him, though. Hargrove has a clear motive for killing Mary. Their marriage is rockier than George's and Martha's, and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? The question of means and opportunity is murkier. The same notions surely foremost in everyone's mind. Hargrove has somehow co-opted the wills of the bees and coerced them into carrying out his violent commands. But the idea is so patently insane, no one dares say it out loud, let alone shape it into a direct accusation. This is nearly what has happened, as it turns out, but the mechanism by which the bees are controlled isn't quite as mad scientific as it seems from afar. Rival bee wrangler H.W. Manfred has found a way to manipulate the mood and actions of his own hive and guide their attacks without the need to appeal to the hive's non-existent consciousness. He simply applies an elixir of his own concoction to the target's person. He then releases the bees, who seek out the elixir the way a gyroscopic missile might and set on it in a berserk rage. He has likewise trained them to settle down when they sense, they don't really hear, a particular high-pitched tone, one not entirely unlike the screech of a public saxophone. Thus he molds them into something like an attack dog that responds to two simple commands, sick and stay. The mechanism used is somewhat esoteric. It has no real-life counterpart, but not so as to verge on the mystical or magical. No ghost in the hive's machinery is needed to accomplish it. Manfred keeps this hive behind a secret panel in his study, where he corners Vicky in the movie's climax. He plans to kill her and thereby close up the last loose end in his plan to eliminate Hargrove, his principal competition. Like a Bond villain, however, his vanity proves to be his undoing. He simply can't resist detailing his evil plan to Vicky before dispatching her, and as he dawdles, the reel-to-reel tape playing the pacifying tone jams up. Freed from its influence, the bees fall on Manfred. Vicky, meanwhile, deftly sets a fire to make good her escape, one that ultimately consumes Manfred's country home. Here again we see shades of atomic brain and the flaming collapse at Mrs. March's dissolute estate. At the beginning, so too here at the end, the reel-to-reel tape recorder turns up in close association with events of mortal significance. Vicky had used the device to advance professionally only to have it turn on her, and now the same thing has happened to Manfred. If tape is starting to establish pride of place as a guiding metaphor for the self or human spirit, the ribbon of nucleotides and DNA, magnetic data tapes modeling of thought and memory, the capture of our heart and soul in music recording and playback, it only follows that it would also become an agent of tragedy and death. These two are essential aspects of the human experience. Linking technological research with tragedy and death isn't too tricky to do in general. Manfred's work, on a more modest level, pursues almost exactly the same broad goals motivating military researchers in both England and the United States. Dispatching a traveling bomb and deciding where it will go off, which is to say, refining the guided missile. Such quests are explored in more depth in Captain Scarlet and the Mysterons, episode KO2, as Revenge of the Mysterons from Mars, a charmingly warmongering title from the minds of Jerry and Sylvia Anderson. The Andersons made their name with a series of action-packed children's TV shows that have found a devoted following due to their unique experimental look. Dubbed supermarionation and lying somewhere between cartoon and live action, this process involves replacing on-screen actors with detailed marionettes and location shots with elaborate tabletop set pieces. This has a cost, certainly. Since the characters' features are fixed in wood and plastic, their range of emotions is limited to the number of modular heads these sculpting artists can make for them. But what's achieved in trade is a spectacularly expanded palette of futuristic locales, weapons, and transports. The show's appeal, then, has less to do with its characters than its landscapes and accessories, and the readiness with which cutting-edge and wholly imagined technologies can be offered on screen, its ability to render war technologies in unprecedented, scintillating detail. The Andersons, being quite conscious of this, fashioned their hero's home territory into Captain Scarlet's transition title card, thereby ensuring that fans at home will see it more often than anything else. Whenever there's a cut to or from a commercial, we glimpse Spectrum's cloud base, interspersed with other scenes and jump cuts timed to the beating of a kettle drum. The base perpetually hovers thousands of feet above the ground. How far we've come from the lofty aspirations of the Duchess of Bois de Boulogne. What keeps it there is that product of pseudoscience, a device that counteracts the pull of gravity. Alas, the functional challenges of making a heavier-than-air object float are in inverse relation to the ease with which such an object can be imagined. Anti-gravity usually appears in the possession of extraterrestrials. It's what powers the Day the Earth Stood Still's flying saucer, for instance. And the inelegant helicopter is as close as Earthlings have come to achieving it. For this reason, though anti-gravity is portrayed in the show as being of human origin, its audiences are more likely to think of it as alien. This is true of both Lost in Space and Forbidden Planet, too, of course, but they and a handful of others are statistical outliers in a genre that tends to leave saucer tech in the realm of the other. The commingling of real and fanciful technologies goes back at least as far as Undersea Kingdom. This commingling of terrestrial and alien technologies is a more recent development. The other founding instance of this in Scarlet is seen in the skyline over London during a battle between Spectrum and the Mysterons, a ghostly Martian race seemingly bent on humanity's destruction. In a trick familiar to purveyors of pulp sci-fi, from Invasion of the Body Snatchers to The Human Duplicators, 1965, episode 420, the Mysterons can swap out any person with a functional replacement that will pass for the original under any casual examination. They've used this to advantage by body-snatching Captain Scarlet, Spectrum's ablest field officer, and arranging to have the dupe kidnap the world president. Following an elaborate exchange of gunfire, Scarlet falls to his death, only to turn up in the next scene, alive and well and seemingly back to his original self. He isn't quite, however. Some fluke in the manner of his demise has reconfigured him to be as invincible as Godzilla. Thus is the rest of the show set up, as Spectrum comes to rely on this unfair advantage to prevail in every subsequent battle with the Mysterons, or at least wrangle them into a stalemate. Each time Scarlet dies, a short interregnum passes before he can shake his mortal coil back on, during which he is indistinguishable from an ordinary corpse. This results in some moments of, if you'll pardon me, wooden gallows humor, particularly since Spectrum has opted to keep Scarlet's power a secret. In White as Snow, Colonel Snow, Spectrum's frontline manager, threatens Scarlet's dead body with court-martial, leaving the others standing around the slab, who have not yet been read on his condition, nonplussed. Elsewhere, Scarlet deserts Spectrum, a capital offense, but turns out to have had a good reason. Snow sentences him to death, which again earns sideways glances from those not in the know. Only Snow and an elect cadre of Spectrum insiders are aware that for Scarlet, capital punishment is a mere procedural scold, not much worse than paid time off. The only punishment that would truly undo him is exile. Jokes aside, all this does raise questions. What sort of entity has Scarlet become? What is it like to cycle regularly back and forth between the afterlife, or the void, and a human form? Does every painful death he suffers become lodged in his memory? Like the LSD user or one of Huxley's travelers through the doors of perception, Scarlet should have all manner of news to report from the worlds beyond our own, but he doesn't. The police action in Vietnam has spiraled into a slaughter rivaling the Korean conflict in magnitude, and this time around England has mostly declined to participate. They committed advisors and other resources to the area, but have blanched at sending large numbers of combat troops. This puts them in the envious position of observing the American establishment's catastrophic failure in foreign policy rather than having to lament it, which is something the Andersons do in Captain Scarlet just about every time the Americans turn up. Like Manfred, the villainous Mysterons cannot contain themselves and tip their hand every week by telepathically beaming an alien voice into the Spectrum agents' heads, explaining what their next target is going to be. Make the motives behind the attacks themselves quite explicit. In The Real New York, the voice cites as motivator for the upcoming assault man's affinity for greed and corruption. The sad flaws of our species are insinuated to be emanating from England's wayward colony across the pond, in particular the Second National Bank in Manhattan. This warning on the part of the Mysteron voice coincides with the machinations of a criminal gang, one whose black operations open the episode. A two-person submarine finds Silent Harbor on a little-used, naked shore in dead of night. The clandestine criminals alight, entice a night watchman with a spooky, hypnotizing Frisbee-style electric disc, and put in a speech with aerosolized fumes. They then have run of the Spectrum operation. They lounge around the spectacularly outfitted wood-panel living room they've commandeered, perusing Spectrum's most closely held documents at leisure. In these they find a description of the Mysterons, these voices from beyond the atmospheric dimension, and glean their key ability. The Mysterons practice retrometabolism, the ability to replace the essence of a living thing or the physicality of a neutered object by destroying its original form. This, we've also since learned, is what gave Captain Scarlet his gift of immortality. The gangster immediately schemes to use the various covert visages of the Mysterons and Spectrum's sophisticated detection mechanisms against both groups at the same time. He and his team roll up on a Spectrum checkpoint masquerading as drunk revelers behind the wheel. They fool the watchmen into thinking they're about to plunge their gray saloon off the hilly highway and do just that, only using dummy substitutes. They design to have the tower-bound watchman observe the cataclysm in his binoculars. Watching manipulated marionettes situate tiny replica dummies of themselves in a model car is a fascinatingly fetishistic experience. The key coincidence in this episode's narrative draws attention. Why would the Mysterons and the criminal gang target the Second National Bank at the same time, but for entirely different reasons? It's true Spectrum and the world community have evacuated Manhattan, this coming as a leisurely response to the Mysterons' threat and creating a void in the public space miscreants could freely exploit. But there seems to also be a mystical quality to coincidences of this kind, a want to connect happenstance and subterfuge that lurks more in the subconscious than in the rational mind. But there seems to also be a mystical quality to coincidences of this kind, a want to connect happenstance and subterfuge that lurks more in the subconscious than in the rational mind. Think of the guiding coincidences in Psycho, the chance meeting of embezzler and onanist at Bates Motel. Are the alien killers and the criminals merely lashing out, exhibiting an animalistic fundament to the character of consciousness? Or are they enacting a sinister agenda, agents of a larger purpose?
Thank you, the birds. I'm sure we all wish them the very best on their forthcoming tour of America.